Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Real Estate Rewind. My name is Scarlett Schuetze, and I am the daughter of the host, Tyson Schuetze. Today's episode is about the investor's journey. We have Aaron and Tyson to talk with us more about it. Please follow us on. You can follow us on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. So like and subscribe.
Welcome to Real Estate Rewind. I'm your host, Tyson Schuetze. I am joined by Aaron Isley today, and today I am sitting in the individual who's going to be interviewed chair. And Aaron is going to, talk a little bit with me about the investor journey and how a lot of the services that we've created at Auben are really a parallel for the journey that I've been on myself as an investor. So I'm excited to be here. And as a reminder, you can follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music and learn more about Real Estate Rewind, where every 2 weeks we have a new episode that we drop on Thursday to interview a real estate professional, an Auben team member, somebody that we believe can help other investors and real estate professionals on their own journey. So thank you guys for joining us, and excited to be here today.
Yeah, no, this will be a good one today. I think in our last episode, we were talking to your dad and to Natalie, who I like to call the OG Auben team members, right?
Yes.
So we've had fun, kind of exploring the foundation of Auben and some of those early days. And I think, as we talk about this investor journey, it's important to, talk about your journey as an investor, because that helped to inform what Auben is today as a company, right? Across all 4 service lines, and being kind of this circular, cyclical journey for investors. But I guess I'll start with, in the early days of your investor journey, kind of some of those days that we were talking about in the last episode with your dad and Natalie. You were a very active investor.
Yes.
And I have this visual that comes to mind. I think it was when it was Auben's 15th anniversary. You sent over a bunch of early photos from the early days. And one that is seared in my memory is you spraying Febreze on wood chips that I think had an odor that you weren't necessarily fond of before an open house. So when I was thinking about this episode and kind of like the investor journey, I was thinking about that photo, and it's kind of hilarious, but it does speak to the fact that you can't be more active in your investments than trying to control the way, something smells as you are, going into an open house to sell one of the, one of the houses that you've just flipped. Or
I think that image is a good, maybe a good representation of some of the downfalls of being too active in your investment, right?
Fair enough.
Not having enough time to prepare and plan for everything. I think the situation that we ended up with is, I think we had some mulch maybe delivered last minute and it smelled awful, right? Like it was like one of those things where it's, fresh out of the yard. And so like we had just spent all this time and energy having an open house, and we were resorting to whatever, whatever means we could to just try to make the home inviting. And so I think one of the things I've said for a number of years is I think most investors would benefit from being active in their investments at some point, right? I think before Auben even existed, I was managing some of my own homes. And I think the benefit to doing that, Aaron, is you really begin to understand what it takes to manage real estate, right? What you should expect from your investments and what you should expect from the team that you ultimately hired to manage those investments. I think one of the challenges that I experienced, and hopefully what I can talk about here today, is when you are so active in your investments, and you're doing all the functions and all the services, it really prevents you from being a specialist in the pieces that may be most beneficial to your investing journey, which is, generally being elevated from less of a tactical on the ground sort of, hey, I'm going to execute the kind of, day-to-day activity, and being more strategic about what you're buying, how you're financing it, how you're, sourcing the capital for it. And so a lot of those lessons I think I learned the hard way because I was very active. But what I hope to discuss today is Auben's evolution really mirrored my learning experience and my journey as an investor. So happy to start wherever is helpful for you.
Well, I think it would be helpful to start, we're using the term investor journey, but what exactly does that look like?
Yeah.
And how did that turn into, these distinct service lines that Auben offers today, which looks a little bit different than other traditional property management or, brokerages?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So I think I would use the term investor in the early days. Maybe that was more of an aspirational title.
Okay.
I joke most investors I think are collectors first, right? And I think part of the difference is when you're starting out investing, I think it's very easy to be distracted by somewhat of a shiny object syndrome. It's like, oh, this is a deal, and you become someone that is really sort of chasing deals as opposed to being intentional and disciplined about your investment. So for me, my investment really started flipping homes, right? So that was the initial investment that I was focused on. The idea was if we could flip enough homes to generate enough cash, we could use that to invest in rental property. That was the strategy. What happened was post 2008, everything changed, and we ended up with a handful of homes that we couldn't sell. And so that really kind of accelerated my timeline into being what most people would call as more of a traditional landlord investor. I had just a couple of homes, after 2008 that we couldn't sell. And really, I went to some of the more traditional brokerages to try to see if they could provide a service that would manage the asset. And what I found was their services were not investor focused, right? They were really focused on how do we take this home that's a rental and turn it into a sales listing. There was a concept of sort of this home is just on its way to becoming a sales listing, because most of those other brokerages, that's what their bread and butter was, right? They're investors that were holding assets long term, and they were providing management services for traditionally were more like a commercial asset, an office building, a retail, the concept of intentional professional property management
For residential.
Yeah. And that's a good distinction. I think it definitely existed in larger multifamily, right? And it definitely existed in retail and office and other commercial asset classes. But specifically, a scatter site single family home, an individual single family home, the concept of intentional property management around 2008 it didn't really exist. And part of that was the technology that really needed to be there to allow it to be managed more effectively was still developing at that point. So we started with property management in 2009, the fall of 2009, and we really leaned into looking at it through the lens of an investor first and foremost. So I think the property management fees that I saw at other brokerages at the time, some of them just didn't make sense for an investor. They may have made sense for the management company, but some of the places where the management companies were making some of their largest fees seemed like they may be in direct opposition with an owner. So, for example, a lot of the early property management companies, their heaviest fee was the lease-up fee, which I think is understandable. But there weren't fee structures around renewing the residents. So there were a lot of times where a property management company would just be focused just on the lease-up and less concerned with the retention of the resident in there. And so there were a lot of little examples of those type things where we really said, okay, because I was an investor first and a manager second, how can we find that middle ground where, we need to support our team and provide, a good fee structure for the management company. We also need to serve the investors, because the goal and thought process was, well, if this will work for me, surely there's going to be other people that would need the services.
Well, and I think an important distinction there too is by serving the investor, you're serving the resident, right?
Yeah,
because you know a happy resident is going to have a higher retention rate and all of that. So maybe it is approaching property management a little bit differently. But why do you think that property management is kind of the backbone of being an investor, and what kind of, where investors might be drawn to Auben in the beginning?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges about management, we'll talk about this later in the show, is like, I think as a property manager, especially when you don't have other services that you're providing, you can be a catch-all for a lot of things, right? Very quickly you can go from property manager to maintenance technician to inspector to to general contractor, right? And I think because that stability of the asset and the resident and the recurring rent is really what drives a good investment, that has to be right, or you don't get the opportunity to perform all the other functions, right? I think what happens, or at least happened very frequently back in those days, is you had these individuals or small companies that were doing property management, but their owners were asking them for all these other pieces that they needed help with. And a lot of the property managers, especially initially, were providing services they weren't even charging for, or maybe not providing services and maybe recommending people or not recommending people that ultimately made it harder for them to manage. And so the first service that we ever added after property management was project management, which to us is more of a renovation oversight. It's turning the assets, doing renovations. And really, initially, Aaron, it was less about, hey, we need to make this profitable, and more, how do we make sure when that asset comes back to us to manage, it'll be in the condition to attract the right tenant, to have a happy tenant, a happy resident that will have less issues with their move-in and want to stay long-term. And so we really started going in that direction of figuring out, what can we standardize? What contractors locally will deliver or meet our expectations of what the home should be in terms of quality? How do we know that we know the paint on the walls, so if it needs to be touched up, we have to do a repair, we could address it without having a larger expense to the owner. It was really looking at it from a number of different angles, and it just all pointed to that sort of turnover piece, right? Because I think we probably had one of those sort of rude awakenings where we went from 15, 20, 30 homes, and suddenly half of them were vacant, and some of them were coming back 2 weeks later perfect, and some of them were coming back 3 months later not ready to be leased at all. And so we added that function to try to have some better outcomes, in terms of rent-ready homes for our residents and for our owners.
So Auben started with, property management as a service, and then added the project management. Yep. And with property management, there's maintenance, correct?
Yep.
So what, I guess the brokerage piece came last, and then maybe we can talk about this full cycle, or, how it's kind of intended to be, and then, where different people come into it.
Sure, yeah. So we started with, as we said, the property management first. The project management was the second piece, and really the project management, we were already doing some basic project management functions for owners that were trying to buy some homes at discounts and renovate them to resell them. So we were already doing some of that, but we realized how necessary that was for the homes that we were managing. That was a big, and so those two pieces became connected. Shortly thereafter, as you alluded to, maintenance was the next piece, and maintenance is evolved for us, right? I think in the early days, it was really more of, hey, we've got this, issue or this item that needs to be addressed. Who do we sort of know in our Rolodex or in our phone that we can call? And I think, it was maybe in the earlier days more of a dispatch, right? Of, hey, we've got this and we're processing it. As we've continued to work on it, we've really, beefed up and tried to sort of build out that portion, where the maintenance is not just maintenance, but it's inspections, right? And I actually met with a individual today that, he's a property manager out of Atlanta, and we were just talking about property management, and it took me back to some of the early days of Auben. He had grown his doors under management from, zero basically 5 or 6 years ago to 600 doors. And I was thinking about what were some of the things that I wish I would have done at that sort of point. And one of the things I told him is I would have added the inspection piece far earlier in the process, right?
Okay.
Because that inspection piece done correctly helps really not only, have a good understanding of the condition of the asset, but it really helps have a more impactful management with the maintenance department specifically, right? It really drives that maintenance function. If you have inspections that move out, move in, if you do inspections during occupancy, all the other things there, it really is
And
crucial.
talk about some of the technology that started, coming about to make that process easier.
Yeah. So, and that's we had just referenced that earlier. I think it's maybe not easy for some people that haven't been in the business for a long time to realize how little sort of tools or technology were available back then, right? I mean, everybody did not have a camera on their phone that they could just quickly sort of, photograph something. And really, when we started, there weren't good even management softwares, right? So you had to have, in many ways, a very sort of old-fashioned process. A lot of our original inspections didn't include any photos, right? Because that was what existed at the time. The concept of printing out photos and doing that would not have been what was needed. Now, it's amazing to me of how you can get these fully detailed 360-degree imaging of everything of the asset, right? And how collecting that and documenting it appropriately, and we'll talk about this too on the show, at the point of acquisition and before you go sort of fully down the road with the investment can be so helpful, right? I think as we started growing and we started working with larger investors, just even things we were actually talking about this on a call with one of our partner realtors in Kansas City. We would do these things called video and go, right? Where we would go assess an asset with a video, right? And it was an individual talking about the asset, taking images or video of important details of the roof, the HVAC system, the water heater, but it was also them giving some context of just things that are harder to see if you're just snapping an individual photo, right? So it's really amazing to me how far the tools have come. But I think the challenge is if you're not using those tools in a cohesive manner, it's very easy to get to where one piece of information is isolated and it's really not worth anything. That was one of the things we saw a lot of times is some of the other companies or investors that were doing renovations with other places, an asset would come into us and we would have no idea of what was under warranty, what was, maybe had not only a material warranty, but maybe there's a labor warranty, right? And so really in building out Auben, one of the other things was we wanted to have as much information about the asset to have an unfair advantage as to how to correct it, right? It would be efficient for our team and also cost effective for our owners. And so to your point, these services, the real sort of, magic happened and some of the struggle, especially as we connected the different services, right? So we had the property management, we had the project management, we had the maintenance, and then brokered sales. When it really kind of works appropriately, in a perfect world, an investor would always start their journey with us at acquisition because we can be helpful and instructive in making recommendations of what renovations are needed for the asset, what items in the home may be in perfectly good condition, what needs to be done at property management, what needs to be done in terms of future maintenance or preservation type repairs and construction. And then ultimately, and this is a lesson I definitely learned the hard way, is determining when that asset should be sold and another investment should be purchased. Because I think if all of that information is collected and processed accordingly, somebody can really begin to be an investor where they're acting with a level of intention. I think it's really difficult. And in this industry, when either you're trying to do it all yourself, which many people do, or you're trying to use a team of different people that are not connecting, right? We had other investors that had, their best friend was a realtor, their cousin was their, project manager or general contractor, and we were their property manager, and then their friend was doing all their maintenance. That isolation of information makes it really difficult to not only improve the asset, but even give the residents a good experience in the home, right? Is you have pieces that you're outsourcing or you're just not equipped to handle with the full, confidence and of information.
And there's a level of transparency too, right?
Yeah.
And when when it's disjointed or the process is disjointed, then you're missing important pieces of information that could be helpful for the owner or the resident.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is too is even if everybody's looking to be helpful and rowing in the same direction and wanting to be a good team player, you just have those functions in isolation that can make it really difficult for an asset to perform as well as it should.
So Auben can, essentially meet an investor wherever they are in the cycle. Generally, sometimes the acquisition's already been made and property management is where you start.
Yeah.
But how does the guidance change between someone, buying their first rental property from someone who has a portfolio of, say, 5 or more?
Mm-hmm. So, and to your point, I think we can absolutely, and we're designed to meet investors where they are, right? Yeah. And I think also, Auben was created and is created for a journey to being more passive. And not every investor wants to do that. And so if an individual wants to be very active in their investments and enjoys the process, we may not be the best fit. So I think that's part of it.
Sure.
And I think in the early days, we were so convinced of the services and wanted to help everybody. We didn't always assess that best we could, right? And so one of the things that we do now is we've got an investor questionnaire when a team member or a potential client comes into Auben, an Auben team member, has a consultation with that individual where they really assess where that investor is, what their objectives are, and how passive do they want to be. Whether that owner has 1 home, 5 homes, or 500 properties, if they're not interested and willing in being passive, it just may not be a good fit, right? And so we want to know that as soon as possible. We also want to know maybe what's working for the investor and what's not. And so in a perfect world, an investor would start their journey with us even prior to acquisition. We could even give some input to, hey, I'm ready to go buy. They would contact one of our agents. Our property management team interacts with our agents to make sure our rents are aligned, right? That they're not going out, and we see this often is, somebody told them, a realtor told them that they could get a certain amount of rent, and it's not achievable because it's not there in the market.
Right.
Many times our journey with our clients will actually begin at the property management phase because that's where an owner is trying to realign their expectations with the market. And so, I think ideally we'd meet them pre-acquisition when they're ready to buy. But we also have some investors that have decided, okay, I've actively managed my properties for 5, 10, or 15 years, and now I'm done. I know what this is like. I want to be more passive. Or maybe I want to take my assets and turn it into capital to invest, which Auben does, in a fund or syndication or different type of investment. So we have other ways where if an investor's been active but deciding they want to be passive, we can meet them there too. But at the end of the day, I think what's interesting and what I always enjoy is no two investors are going to be on the same sort of path. And investors are very different in what they're looking for and what their timeline or horizons are to achieve that. We've got some investors where they're only looking for cash flow and they're only going to buy that property or that asset if it cash flows. And so I think for those investors, that's what Auben was originally set up for, is more conservative sort of cash flow investors. What's interesting now is it's really difficult to find cash flow or yield in a lot of our markets. We've got some investors that they want it to cash flow and they want it to be a good investment, but they're prioritizing the tax benefits even ahead of the cash flow, right? It still has to be a sound investment, still needs to cover all the expenses, but you've got high net worth individuals or people that feel they're paying too much in taxes as a W-2, and it doesn't even have to be a high net worth individual that are using real estate as a tool to lessen their tax burden.
Well, and I think, the more experience an investor gets, like it seems like cash flow is important for a lot of investors, but, there are, Auben has a way of being kind of a guiding advisor too, to be able to, open the door to another savings, or maybe it might not be cash, but it might be cost seg or, some of these other tools that, an investor might not even know exist. So I think that's another real benefit of having, all of these services in one, is that, there are different areas where Auben can provide expertise, and it's all inclusive. It's kind of, I know we use this term turnkey, and not always, everyone may not agree on what that is, but honestly, I mean, there is everything that potentially an investor would need. And even if we don't do it ourselves, or Auben do it themselves as far as, financing or whatever, there are a ton of, resources that Auben has.
Yeah, and I think ultimately for that, Aaron, is, what Auben can provide is the full range of operational services where for somebody to be as close to passive as possible, right? I think one of the lessons I learned, and we learned at Auben, is even with all those operations, there's still an asset management function that somebody has to perform. And that's either going to be the investor of the property, or in some cases, Auben is now performing asset management for select clients, right? And that's somebody that we've, or investor or team of investors that we identify as being aligned, with us in terms of being willing to be passive, trusting our, expertise, and then proceeding in a way that allows them to even be more passive than they would just utilizing all of our services.
So switching gears a little bit here, you often say buy right, hold tight. What does buying right actually mean beyond securing, a good purchase price?
Yeah, I think I look back to some of the investments that I made initially, and it's a cliche, but it's true, is like, you really are defined by, what you buy, what you pay for it, what variables, you can control, what variables are beyond your control. And I actually did a blog recently. We've got a blog that, do called REI News and Market Moves. And, the blog was on how LinkedIn just named Augusta as one of the top markets in the country, right? And through writing this blog, I reflected on how helpful buying property in Augusta was for my investment philosophy of Augusta, especially when I started 15, 20 years ago, was a really, good market to find cash flow, right? You could, without a ton of effort and energy, you could find homes where at the purchase price plus a reasonable renovation, you could get enough rent more than cover your debt service, your maintenance, your CapEx, insurance, all the expenses. And so for me, without even realizing it, that became a investment strategy that was foundational to everything that we've done at Auben, everything we've done with, our investments that we've done at Auben, my investments, there has to be either existing cash flow or a potential to get a strong cash flow. And I think that's different than particularly some of the other markets that we've gone into over the past couple of years. These larger primary markets that have been very dynamic, a lot of investors, and if it works for them, that's, I'm not knocking it, but a lot of these investors are acquiring assets or investing in real estate where the only way for the deal to work is on market conditions that are improving, right? Or moving in a positive direction. And so for us, we want to be in those markets, and we want to be investments that we can catch that wave of, appreciation, equity growth, rental growth. But we also want to do it with the most conservative assets we could find. And so traditionally, we're going to buy value add assets. We're trying to buy them right where we can see a very clear path to this home is under rented, and if we do X, Y, Z to it, we can get a higher rent. And then I think for the hold tight kind of piece of the sort of, that's the buy right, but for the hold tight piece, I think it's making sure that, there is no sort of set it and forget it in this business. Even with a sort of team of experts, I think you always have to be thinking towards what is the exit going to be, how is this asset performing? And I think one of the biggest mistakes I made as an investor is having assets that maybe we bought it right, we did the right renovation, but for whatever reason, it just had more issues and was not going to be a good investment. And I think there were a lot of those, definitely a number of those, maybe not a lot, but there are definitely a number of those that I can look back and say, okay, we were too stubborn sort of, with our persistence of this asset. By holding it tight, we should have looked closer to say it's just underperforming, and it's underperformed for a couple years. Maybe, the version of that is actually letting go of this asset because we're holding it so tight to sort of our visibility to know that it's just not performing the way that we need it to.
Are there any assets in your recent memory or not that you've been too emotional about?
Yes.
I think this is a big part of it. It's hard to be objective about real estate all the time.
I'm smiling and laughing a lot because I think, Aaron, one of the misconceptions about investors is that they're not emotional, right? And I think ultimately what you'll find is you're dealing with, even if it's an investment property, you're dealing with something that it's hard to not become attached to. And so I think really, probably a lot of the decisions that I've made that have not been good with real estate was an asset that I was too attached to, right? Or too stubbornly persistent. And for whatever reason, there just are certain assets that maybe the original build wasn't good, right? Like you can go in and do everything you're supposed to do, but the maintenance and repairs will eat you alive. Or you can have an asset that maybe you like, and for whatever reason, it just turns over every year, right? And it's really hard to make, really even just cover costs when you have assets that are turning over. And so, I think one of the things that I wish somebody had sort of told me early on in real estate is even if you love the asset, there are ideal times to consider selling it, right? When you've still got, maybe some good tax benefits left potentially, or in certain market cycles, or in many cases, it can just be a function of when you did the last renovation, right? If you don't sell the asset, I think what you have to be planning for is the fact that everything will sort of need to be replaced in there.
Yeah.
And everything in there is designed to break on a very formulaic schedule, right? Like your HVAC, your water heater, your roof, your appliances. And I learned that lesson the hard way. Some of these homes that we had done massive renovations that I thought, okay, I'm going to just hold this indefinitely. 5, 6, 7, especially 7 to 10 years down the road, I was spending more on renovations than I had on some of the houses originally, right? And that's a hard kind of pill to swallow. And I think done correctly, you can have that on much more of a schedule, right? And I think that's really, again, we've used this a lot, but that's that's the journey from from a collector to more of an investor, right? You become intentional, formulaic, disciplined about this is when I'm buying the asset, this is when I'm going to do the asset, and this is when I'm going to sell the asset.
But it also, it helps to have someone who's completely unbiased about the asset to, maybe prod you along.
Yeah.
Because, sometimes we're our own worst enemies and seeing the forest through the trees. So it does help to have a team behind you to say, like, let's look at all of these things and kind of make a decision. Or you're not even thinking about it, and you get the call that's like, hey, let's check in about your portfolio, and you hadn't even realized that you were creeping up on the 7 to 10 year mark, and it might be time to think about those things, because the worst thing to happen is that you've just learned that you have to replace all of these things when you hadn't been thinking about it. So it's a surprise. It's better to be prepared for those so that you're making intentional rather than reactive decisions.
Yeah, I think also what I've found too, and this is not only true with my investments and some of my assets, but a lot of these things happens in waves too, right? So it's like it's like you can have the best plans, but there's always a scenario or situation. It seems like when one roof needs to be placed, there'll be 3 or 4 of them right behind it, right? So
my favorite saying is, and I might have come up with this.
Yeah, we can trademark it.
Yeah, we can. It's hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so I think it's. I mean,
did someone else say that?
I don't know. I feel like I've seen that on a coffee mug or like a poster, I feel like that's on a T-shirt somewhere. Maybe you came up with it.
Maybe I came up with it. But I'm gonna do some digging.
Yeah,
hope for the best, plan for the worst.
But I think ultimately with the investments too. I think when you have those plans in place, and you bring up a good point, is you've got to stick to them too, right? Because the one thing about real estate is there are always unexpected things that happen, right? And they do always seem to happen in these clusters.
Okay, but for someone who's looking to learn something on this show, like what might some of those real world signals be that tell you that it's time to sell, reinvest, or change strategy?
So I think a lot of it can be something where you can look at it just in a matter of time, right, and years. So one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in our Chattanooga market right now, is we had a lot of investors that were buying, let's just call it 4 to 6 years ago, right? During COVID, when rates were really low, especially at the early years, 2019, 2020, 2021, there were a lot of people looking into investing in real estate. There was a shortage on inventory. And so you had people that were very aggressively buying, in some places, and paying prices that made a lot of sense at the time, but also making offers that were with no contingencies or potentially over ask, right? And some of these assets were really good assets that we're still managing, but a lot of those investors are just now beginning to see, well, wait a second. I just spent $500 on HVAC and I just spent $1,000 on plumbing. Those two expenses, that's my monthly rent for this side of this, duplex or whatever. And so I think when you begin to see, the expenses creep, really it's too late, right? And, but there's still things that can be done at that point, right? But ideally, if, an investor is just sort of looking at a calendar, within 5 to 7 years of doing any large renovation or even an initial acquisition, I think at minimum they would do well to assess their mechanical systems, right? Roof, the mechanical systems and a roof, foundation, the big ticket items that are really going to cost them, So I think that, the other thing that we see often is, there are a lot of investors that have had long-term tenants in their properties, and if they're not being regularly inspected or assessed, you can have a great tenant that's taking great care of the home, but if they've been in there 5, 6, 7 years, the odds are that home is going to need a ton of renovation, right? Even if it's been a great tenant, just wear and tear and everything else. So you can also look at it as a function of length of how long the resident has been there, how long has the residency been, and then I think there's other things there that large investors consistently do is if they are going to do a large renovation, they're already setting their clock as to, when they're thinking about selling it. Before the expenses start creeping into the income, you want to be thinking about selling, right? By the time the expenses are really eroding the net operating income, any smart investor is going to penalize the asset in their purchase by pointing out, expenses that are trending in the wrong direction on the repairs and maintenance side. And those are really the biggest variables that are hard to contend with. What's been cool that really didn't exist when I started, it definitely nowhere near to how prevalent it is now, is these new construction assets, built for rent, brand new rental homes where there's no guarantee that there's not going to be any repairs and maintenance with a lot of these, but with a new construction home, an investor can go into it, modeling a lot lower probability of any repairs and maintenance. And we've even got some partners that have leaned into different repair programs and warranty programs and,
the preventative maintenance.
Preventative maintenance and just, when you have a new home, there's an ability to really get what I call a nice honeymoon period of, the asset's going to perform well for a while. So, so.
Anything else you want to talk about? And I do have a final question.
Yeah, I think ultimately what we really want to communicate, at Auben is we can meet investors wherever in their journey they may be. And ultimately, that journey may change, right? Life circumstances. I think what's been interesting, too, is the more we can understand about what investors' objectives are, the more we can be helpful in guiding them into the right investments and how to manage those investments. And that starts correctly done early on. And I think a lot about we're having a former Auben team member who's now a wealth manager come talk to, some of our, team about investment and retirement. And, it's very common for, an individual who's a wealth manager selling you stocks and bonds to spend a lot of time to try to understand what your personal goals are, what your objectives are, what your risk tolerance, but somewhere along the way in sort of real estate and the ability for people to go out there and, watch some TikTok videos and go figure it out, some of that conversation and thought and tension around what is the right investment for me, I think has been lost, right? And there's a lot of managers out there that I think have never owned real estate investments and a lot of different companies that are not equipped to sort of help investors in that journey, that we can sort of distinguish ourselves by both the investor and Auben spending enough time and energy to slow down to just assess, where's that investor, where are the assets, are they in the right assets, are they in the right market, right? That's one of the cool things that I'm really excited about Auben is we now have the ability for an owner to own diverse assets in different markets. And we've got a client that we're working with right now, a couple of them, but one in particular that's got some underperforming assets in 2 of the markets that we're in. And we're looking at repositioning those assets while also ensuring that they're more diverse in their holdings across all of our markets. So there's a really cool, tool that's available now, I think because of, data technology and a lot of things that weren't there when we started, where an investor can have a more diverse, less risky, and more personalized portfolio of real estate, right? And that also gets the investor in a position where they have to be less worried about things beyond their control. Like, one of the things that people always said to me about Augusta when I moved there and started Investor is, what happens if Fort Gordon closed down? Fort Gordon, for those who don't know, is the military base. It's now been renamed as Eisenhower, and there's a number of reasons as to why it wouldn't close down, because it's been fortified with cyber command jobs and other things there. But there are always examples of that, especially in some of our smaller markets. If you have a major employment shift or things that could be really impactful if that's all of your investments in that one market.
Right.
So,
well, I hope that as part of this story, talking about the investor journey that your daughter introduced so well earlier today, we'll be able to talk to some of those clients and potentially, some other people on Auben's leadership team, to get their perspectives as well.
Yeah, I think we absolutely want to talk with some other Auben, investors and clients about their own journeys, right?
Exactly.
And where they started and where they are in that process. It would be great, too, to talk to some of the other, and we'll make a point of doing some of the other professionals that are helping our investors. You referenced this earlier, but, there's a lot, as much as we do, there's a lot of functions we don't do.
Right.
That we will stop short of, getting that individual or that investment to the right qualified tax professional or the right, legal, team member to be able to really kind of finish off the recommendation. And so that's something that, as much as we want to provide guidance and assistance, we want to do it relative to the market, the assets, all the functions, and then partner with experts locally, regionally, and nationally. And I'm also really excited to talk to some of our leadership team members because we've been able to recruit in some other team members that have been great for me to learn. Auben's evolution, which we talked a good bit about today, was really primarily in single-family homes. And one of the things that's been cool over the past couple of years is we've had a focused effort on bringing in team members from multifamily background. And Auben's core competency mixed with these professionals who have decades of multifamily experience is really allowing us to tailor these, specific personalized strategies for build for rent, which done correctly is really a hybrid of it's the best of how do you take scatter site single family remote efficiency and variability and multifamily, discipline and uniformity and managing the sort of P&L and combine those. And that's where I'm really excited, is I think those team members, are opening up whole other opportunities for Auben that, 5 to 10 years ago weren't available, and so it's also contributing to my journey of learning more about different assets, right? And it's taken my investments in different directions too. So,
no, that's super exciting.